"Ma'am, you need to leave. This area is for verified clients only." The sentence didn't echo loudly, but it cut through the polished marble lobby like a blade, sharp enough to turn heads and freeze conversations mid-sentence. And Gabrielle Hudson didn't move, not even an inch, not because she hadn't heard him, but because she had, and because she had heard it before, in different tones, in different cities, from different faces that all carried the same quiet certainty that she did not belong. The bank was cool, precisely 72 degrees, the kind of climate-controlled calm designed to signal wealth and stability. Yet the air around her felt charged, heavy, like something invisible had just shifted, and the man standing behind the desk, a tall white manager with a crisp tie and a rehearsed smile that had now vanished, looked at her not with curiosity, but with conclusion. Gabrielle stood there in dark jeans, a simple cream blouse, and low heels, no designer logos, no visible status, just presence, controlled and unshaken, the kind that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway, though to him it translated as something else entirely, something dismissible. "I'm here to access a private account," she said, her voice even, measured, carrying just enough weight to signal certainty without inviting confrontation. But the manager barely listened, already shaking his head, already stepping into a role he seemed far too comfortable playing. "That's not possible without prior clearance," he replied, louder this time, as if volume could validate judgment. And a few nearby clients began to watch, subtle at first, glances over shoulders, a pause in typing, the slow lowering of a coffee cup. Gabrielle noticed everything, the way the assistant behind the counter avoided eye contact, the way a security guard near the entrance straightened slightly, already anticipating instruction, the way a well-dressed customer was ushered past her without question just seconds later, and she said nothing, because she understood something. They didn't. This moment wasn't spontaneous, it was revealing. "I'd like you to run my name," she added, calm as still water, but the manager's lips curled faintly, not quite a smile, more like disbelief disguised as professionalism. "We don't run names for walk-ins," he said, and there it was, the word that reframed her entirely. Walk-in, as if she had wandered into a place she couldn't possibly be connected to, as if presence required proof only when it came in her form. A woman seated nearby shifted uncomfortably, whispering something under her breath, while another man pretended not to notice at all, eyes glued to his phone, the silent agreement of a room that didn't want to get involved. Gabrielle exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because she had seen this exact pattern unfold before, years ago, when she was 23 and told her account activity didn't align with her profile when she was 30 and asked for additional verification no one else seemed to need, and now here it was again, polished, dressed in policy, delivered with confidence. "I'm not asking twice," the manager said, stepping slightly closer now, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. "You're going to need to leave." And the security guard took one step forward, not aggressive, not yet, but enough to make the message visible. Gabrielle finally turned her head, slowly, deliberately, meeting the manager's eyes, and in that moment, there was no anger, no urgency, just something far more unsettling, a calm that didn't match the situation, a stillness that suggested this wasn't the beginning of something for her, but the confirmation of something already decided. And when she spoke again, it wasn't louder, but it carried further than anything else in the room. "You're making this official," she said, and for a fraction of a second, something in the manager's expression flickered, not doubt, not yet, but the faintest crack in certainty, as if somewhere, deep beneath the surface of his authority, a question had just begun to form, one he wouldn't understand until it was far too late. Gabrielle Hudson did not rush her next move. She simply reached into her bag with the same calm precision she had carried through every boardroom she had ever walked into, her fingers brushing against a slim black phone, and as she pulled it out, there was no urgency in her posture, only intention, the kind that made the moment stretch just a little longer than it should have, just enough for the room to feel it. The manager watched her closely now, his earlier confidence still intact but no longer effortless, as if something about her refusal to react the way he expected had unsettled the rhythm he relied on, and behind him the assistant shifted again, glancing between them, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent, choosing silence like most people did when discomfort entered a room dressed as authority. Gabrielle tapped the screen once, then twice, and brought the phone to her ear, not turning away, not stepping aside, keeping her place exactly where she stood as if the floor itself belonged to her, which in a way it did, though no one here understood that yet. "Caroline," she said, her voice low but steady, the name landing softly but carrying weight. "Log an incident at the downtown branch. Full compliance review. Timestamp it now." And there was no explanation, no raised tone, just a statement that sounded less like a complaint and more like the beginning of something procedural, something already in motion. On the other end, Caroline Pierce, her executive legal advisor, did not hesitate. Her response immediate, practiced, confirmed. "Gabrielle, initiating documentation and internal audit flag. Do you want escalation?" And Gabrielle's eyes remained on the manager as she answered, "Not yet. Let it develop." And that choice, that pause, was deliberate, because she had learned long ago that people revealed more when they believed they were in control. The manager let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, shaking his head slightly as if to dismiss what he had just heard. "You can make all the calls you want. It does not change the fact that you are not authorized to be here," he said, louder now, reclaiming the attention of the room. And a few customers shifted again, some leaning forward, others pretending not to listen but clearly doing exactly that. Gabrielle lowered the phone slowly, not ending the call completely, just enough for Caroline to remain connected, a silent witness on the line, and she looked at him with that same steady gaze, the kind that did not challenge but did not retreat either. "I gave you an opportunity," she said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a fact. And the words landed differently this time, not sharp, but heavy, like something that would matter later, even if it did not seem to matter now. The security guard took another step forward, still measured, still cautious, but closer now, close enough to signal that this was no longer just a conversation. And the manager gestured slightly toward the entrance, a small motion that carried a larger meaning. "Last chance, ma'am," he said, the word ma'am stretched, thin with impatience. "You either leave on your own or we assist you out." And there it was, the line crossing quietly from dismissal into enforcement, from assumption into action. Gabrielle glanced briefly toward the glass doors, sunlight spilling in from the street outside, cars passing, people moving freely without knowing what was unfolding just inside these walls. And for a second, a memory surfaced uninvited. A much younger version of herself standing in another lobby, different city. Same tone, same conclusion drawn before she had spoken a single word. And she remembered how that moment had felt, not loud, not dramatic, just quietly defining, the kind of moment that either narrowed you or sharpened you. And she had chosen sharp. The present returned just as quickly, and she straightened slightly, not in resistance, but in clarity. "You should be very careful about what you do next," she said, still calm, still composed, but now there was something underneath it, something unmistakable, not anger, not fear, but certainty. And that certainty did not belong to someone asking for access. It belonged to someone who already had it. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for doubt to almost register before he pushed past it, doubling down on the role he had already committed to. "Escort her out," he said to the guard, and the room shifted again, attention tightening, conversations fading, every eye now drawn fully into the scene whether they wanted to be or not. Gabrielle did not step back, did not raise her voice. She simply looked at the guard as he approached, her expression unchanged, and then she spoke one more time into the phone, her voice precise, controlled. "Caroline, note that they are proceeding with removal without verification." And there was a brief pause before the response came through, sharper now, more alert. "Logged, Gabrielle. Escalation recommended." And Gabrielle allowed the faintest nod, almost imperceptible, as if confirming something only she could see. "Prepare the team," she said quietly, and then, without resistance, without argument, she turned and began to walk toward the exit on her own terms, not pushed, not rushed, each step measured, each movement deliberate, leaving behind a silence that did not feel resolved, but suspended, like a storm that had not yet reached the shore but was already inevitable. The glass doors closed behind Gabrielle Hudson with a soft, controlled click, the kind of sound that should have ended the moment but instead seemed to seal it, trapping everything that had just happened inside the bank like pressure building behind a wall. And outside, the late morning air felt warmer, brighter, almost indifferent to what had just unfolded. Yet Gabrielle did not pause on the sidewalk. She did not look back. She simply kept walking with the same steady pace, her heels striking the pavement in quiet, even rhythm, each step measured, intentional, as if she had already moved past the scene while everyone inside was still standing in it. Across the street, a black SUV sat idle, engine running, and as she approached, the rear door opened before she reached it. A driver stepping out with quiet efficiency, no questions asked, no hesitation, just recognition, and Gabrielle slid into the back seat, placing her phone beside her as the door closed, shutting out the city noise and replacing it with a controlled silence that felt very different from the one she had just left. Inside the bank, however, the silence had shifted into something less stable, less certain. The manager exhaling sharply as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding, turning back toward his staff with a small, dismissive shake of his head. "People try this all the time," he muttered, louder than necessary, as if the explanation was not just for them but for himself, and a few employees nodded, quick, automatic, eager to align with authority even as something about the situation lingered just beneath the surface. But not everyone moved on so easily, because near the far end of the lobby, a junior analyst named Ethan Cole stood still, his tablet still in his hand, but his attention no longer on the numbers displayed across the screen, his eyes fixed on the space Gabrielle had just occupied, replaying the interaction in fragments that refused to settle into something comfortable. He had seen her face before, not in person, not clearly, but somewhere, in a quarterly report, in a company-wide briefing, in a photograph that had been shown and then quickly replaced by charts and figures, and the memory did not arrive all at once. It pressed in slowly, insistently, like a name just out of reach. He glanced toward the manager, then toward the security guard, then back to the door, and something in his chest tightened. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition beginning to form before it had proof. "You good, Ethan?" a coworker asked from behind the desk, half joking, half curious, and Ethan blinked, forcing a quick nod. "Yeah, I just thought she looked familiar," he said, though even as he spoke the words they felt incomplete, like he had only said part of something much larger. The manager overheard and gave a short laugh, dismissive, practiced. "They all look familiar when they're trying to act like they belong," he replied, turning away as if that ended the conversation. But the sentence did not land the same way for everyone, because this time there was a slight hesitation in the room, a fraction of a beat where no one responded, where the certainty that had filled the space earlier seemed just a little thinner. Ethan lowered his gaze to his tablet again, but he was no longer reading. Instead, he was scrolling, fingers moving faster now, searching through internal directories, archived communications, executive summaries, anything that might confirm the image forming in his mind. And then he found it, not buried, not hidden, just overlooked, a corporate announcement from 18 months ago, a photograph attached, a name printed clearly beneath it, Gabrielle Hudson, Chief Executive Officer, and the moment the image aligned with the memory, everything else snapped into place with it. The voice, the composure, the way she had stood without explanation, and Ethan felt his breath catch slightly, the realization not loud but overwhelming in its quiet clarity. He looked up immediately, scanning the room as if expecting the truth to be visible now that he knew it. But nothing had changed, not yet. The manager still speaking, the assistant still nodding, the guard returning to his post. All of them moving forward inside a reality that had not caught up with what had just happened. Ethan stepped forward, hesitant at first, then more certain. "Sir," he said, addressing the manager, his voice controlled but edged with something new. "I think we need to review what just happened." And the manager barely turned, already irritated by the interruption. "There is nothing to review. We handled it," he replied, sharp and final. But Ethan did not step back this time. "Her name is Gabrielle Hudson," he said, the words landing clearly now, unmistakably. And for a brief second the room stilled again, not dramatically, not completely, but enough for the air to shift, enough for attention to return, enough for doubt to finally enter a space that had been closed to it just moments before. The manager frowned, confusion flickering across his face before resistance pushed it aside. "And that is supposed to mean something?" he asked, though his tone had lost a fraction of its earlier confidence. Just enough to be noticed by those paying attention, and Ethan held his ground, no longer uncertain, no longer searching. "It means," he said carefully, "we may have just removed the wrong person from the wrong place." And somewhere, far beyond the glass doors, the black SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic with quiet precision, carrying Gabrielle Hudson not away from the situation, but directly toward what it was about to become. The manager did not respond immediately, and that pause, small as it was, spread through the lobby like a ripple across still water, subtle but impossible to ignore, because something had changed the moment Ethan Cole said her name out loud, Gabrielle Hudson, and even though most people in the room did not fully recognize it yet, they felt it, the shift from assumption to uncertainty, from control to something far less stable. "You are overthinking this," the manager said finally, forcing a short, dismissive laugh that sounded thinner than before, his tone attempting to reclaim authority but missing the effortless confidence it carried just minutes ago. "We followed protocol." And he turned slightly as if to end the conversation again, but Ethan did not step back this time, his voice steady, more certain now than it had been at any point before. "Sir, that is the chief executive officer," he said, each word deliberate, leaving no room for reinterpretation, and this time the silence that followed was not brief. It held, stretching just long enough for the weight of what he had said to settle into the room. One of the tellers glanced at another, eyes widening slightly, while the assistant behind the desk instinctively reached for her monitor, fingers hovering as if searching for confirmation without yet knowing what to look for. And the security guard near the entrance shifted his stance again, no longer relaxed, no longer certain about the role he had just played. The manager's expression tightened, not fully breaking, but no longer steady. "That is not possible," he said, though the conviction in his voice had already begun to fracture, because somewhere beneath his denial, recognition had started to push through, not as a clear image, but as a feeling that something important had been overlooked. Ethan did not argue. He simply turned his tablet around and stepped closer, bringing up the internal executive directory. The photograph clear, the name unmistakable, Gabrielle Hudson, Chief Executive Officer. And for a moment the manager did not look. He hesitated, as if refusing to confirm what he already feared might be true. But the room had already begun to lean toward the screen, curiosity overtaking hesitation, and when he finally glanced down, even briefly, that was enough. The change in his posture was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a slight straightening that did not signal confidence, but recalibration, as if his mind was already trying to reorganize the last 10 minutes into something that made sense, something that could still be controlled. "That could be outdated," he said quickly, grasping for explanation. "People use names all the time," but the words did not land with the same authority they once would have, because now there was doubt in the room, visible, shared, and once doubt entered, it did not leave easily. Behind him, the assistant finally pulled up the system, typing faster now, her earlier hesitation replaced with urgency, and within seconds the profile appeared again, this time on her own screen, not secondhand, not suggested, but confirmed, executive-level clearance, full access designation, and she froze, her breath catching slightly as she turned her monitor just enough for the manager to see, not saying a word, because she did not need to. The manager's eyes moved from Ethan's tablet to the assistant's screen, back and forth, as if hoping one of them would contradict the other, but they did not. They aligned perfectly. And in that alignment the narrative he had built for himself began to collapse, not loudly, not dramatically, but internally, piece by piece. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again. Customers who had remained passive now exchanged glances more openly, whispers forming, questions surfacing, the quiet agreement that had once supported the manager's authority now dissolving into something far less comfortable. Why did she not say anything? One client murmured under his breath, not expecting an answer but asking it anyway, while another responded softly, Maybe she did not need to. And those words, simple as they were, landed with more weight than anything that had been said so far. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving space but not retreating, his role no longer uncertain, no longer passive, because the truth had already been placed in the room and it could not be removed. The manager looked toward the glass doors again, but this time the view felt different, not like an exit, but like a line that had already been crossed. And for the first time since Gabrielle Hudson had walked in, he did not look certain of what came next. Outside, traffic continued as usual, unaware, uninterrupted, but inside the bank, time seemed to slow, not stopping, but stretching, as if giving every person in the room just enough space to understand that something irreversible had just begun, something that would not be resolved by policy or dismissed by tone, something that had already moved beyond this lobby and into a place none of them could control anymore. Inside the SUV, Gabrielle Hudson did not look out the window. She did not check the traffic. She did not replay the scene in frustration, because for her the moment had already moved past emotion and into structure, into process, into consequence, and across from her, seated with composed precision, was Caroline Pierce, who had joined the car 2 blocks down without a word, a legal tablet already open in her lap, the screen filled with timestamps, flag language, and internal compliance codes that were now lighting up one by one. "Full incident report is active," Caroline said, her tone level, efficient. "Audio log from your call is secured. We have the time of removal, the names of the employees on shift, and the surveillance request is already in motion." And Gabrielle nodded once, not impressed, not surprised, simply confirming that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. "Pull prior complaints from this branch," Gabrielle said, her voice quiet but exact. "Filter for bias. Indicators, escalation failures, anything dismissed without review." And Caroline's fingers moved instantly, navigating through layers of internal systems that most employees did not even know existed. Because this was not just a reaction. This was a framework designed for moments like this, moments when silence revealed more than resistance ever could. Back inside the bank, however, the silence had begun to fracture completely. The earlier confidence replaced with a low, restless tension that no one could ignore. The manager pacing now behind the desk, his movements sharper, less controlled, as if motion itself could restore the authority that had already slipped from his grasp. "We need to verify this," he said abruptly, though no one had argued otherwise, his voice carrying a new urgency that had not been there before, and the assistant nodded. Quickly, already pulling deeper records, cross-checking internal identifiers, each confirmation only tightening the reality they were trying to process. Ethan Cole remained where he stood, no longer hesitant, no longer unsure, watching as the system confirmed what he had already known. And for the first time since Gabrielle had walked in, the hierarchy of the room had begun to shift, not formally, not yet, but perceptibly, because truth, once introduced, had a way of rearranging power without needing permission. She should have said something, one employee muttered under their breath, the statement sounding less like justification and more like a question they did not want to fully ask. And Ethan turned slightly, his response calm but firm. "She did," he said. "We just did not listen." And that landed differently, because it was not an accusation, it was a mirror. The security guard near the entrance glanced toward the door again, his earlier posture gone, replaced with something closer to unease, because his role in the moment was no longer abstract. It was specific, recorded, and now, potentially accountable. Outside, the SUV slowed briefly at a red light, the city moving around it in ordinary patterns that felt almost disconnected from the precision unfolding inside the vehicle. And Gabrielle finally picked up her phone again, not to call, but to review, scrolling through the initial report that Caroline had already compiled, each detail laid out with clinical clarity, each action assigned a time, a name, a category, and she paused for just a second on one line. Unauthorized removal without verification, reading it not as a complaint, but as a conclusion. "Initiate formal escalation," she said, not raising her voice, not changing her tone, but the shift in her words marked a turning point, because escalation did not mean attention, it meant consequence. Caroline nodded. Already sending the directive, her screen updating in real time as notifications began to move through the internal network, compliance, executive oversight, legal review, each department receiving the same message, the same incident, the same unfolding reality. Back at the branch, the first sign came quietly, almost invisibly, as the assistant's screen flickered and then refreshed, access levels shifting, administrative controls temporarily restricted, and she froze, staring at the change as if it might reverse itself, but it did not. "Sir," she said, her voice lower now, tighter. "The system is locking us out of certain functions." And the manager turned sharply, confusion cutting through the last of his denial. "That is not possible," he said, though he was already stepping closer, already looking, already seeing the same thing she was, because the system was no longer responding the way it had just minutes ago. And in that moment, the realization did not arrive as a single thought. It arrived as a cascade, every action from the past hour recontextualized at once, every word, every decision, every assumption now part of something much larger than he had understood when he made them. Ethan watched the screen from a distance, not surprised, not satisfied, just aware, because this was no longer about whether they had made a mistake. It was about what that mistake had triggered, and the room felt it, the shift from control to consequence, from local authority to something far beyond it. Outside, the light turned green. The SUV moved forward, smooth, uninterrupted, and Gabrielle Hudson sat back slightly, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as the process she had set in motion began to unfold exactly as it was designed to. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of precision that did not need volume to be absolute. By the time the SUV turned onto a quieter street lined with glass office towers, the process had already moved beyond containment and into exposure, and Gabrielle Hudson did not need to ask for updates because they were arriving in real time. Silent confirmations appearing across Caroline's screen like a system waking up to its own reflection. "Compliance has acknowledged escalation," Caroline said, her tone unchanged but the implication unmistakable. "Executive oversight is now active, and the board liaison has been notified." And Gabrielle gave a slight nod, her gaze steady, not on the screen, but somewhere ahead, as if she could already see the outcome before it fully formed. Inside the bank, however, the atmosphere had shifted from tension into something far more unstable, because systems that had always worked without question were now responding differently, slower, restricted, and the manager stood behind the desk staring at the terminal as if it had betrayed him personally. "Try again," he said sharply to the assistant, though she had already tried twice, her fingers moving again across the keyboard, each attempt producing the same result: limited access. Administrative lockout pending review. And she swallowed slightly before speaking. "It is not letting me override anything." Her voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier certainty that had filled the room. The customers who had remained were no longer pretending not to notice, their attention openly fixed on the unfolding situation, whispers no longer hidden, the narrative shifting in real time from assumption to accountability. Ethan Cole stood a few steps back, watching the system update, itself like a story correcting its own ending, and he did not speak again because he did not need to. The truth he had introduced was now moving on its own, expanding beyond any one person's control. "Call IT," the manager said, his voice tightening, reaching for solutions that felt smaller by the second, and the assistant nodded quickly, dialing with hands that no longer moved as confidently as they had earlier, because now every action felt observed, recorded, part of something larger than the moment itself. Outside, the SUV came to a smooth stop in front of a private office building, understated but precise, the kind of place that did not need to announce its importance because it was already understood by those who mattered, and Gabrielle stepped out without hesitation, her movement fluid, uninterrupted, as if she had simply transitioned from one environment to another without losing momentum. Inside, Caroline continued speaking as she walked beside her. "Legal review has flagged potential policy violations, including failure to verify identity and improper client removal procedures." And Gabrielle listened without reacting, not because it was insignificant, but because it was expected. "Prepare a full response package," Gabrielle said as they entered the building, her voice low but exact. Include prior incidents. I want pattern recognition, not just this event. And Caroline nodded immediately, already adjusting the scope of the report, because this was no longer about a single interaction. It was about a system that had just revealed how it behaved under pressure. Back at the branch, the call to IT had not brought clarity, only confirmation. The technician on the other end speaking carefully, cautiously. Your branch has been flagged under executive compliance review. Certain permissions are temporarily restricted until further notice. And the manager stood still as he listened, the words landing heavier than anything else had so far. Because this was no longer internal confusion. It was external validation of something he could not undo. How long will that take? He asked, though the question sounded smaller than the situation it was trying to contain, and the response came just as measured. That depends on the scope of the review. And then the line went quiet. The assistant lowered the phone slowly, her eyes meeting the manager's for a brief moment. And in that exchange there was no longer certainty, no longer hierarchy, only shared realization. Because whatever this had become, it was no longer theirs to manage. One of the customers near the seating area stood up, adjusting his jacket as he looked toward the exit. I think I will come back later, he said to no one in particular. But the message was clear. The environment had shifted from professional to uncertain, and people were beginning to respond accordingly. Ethan glanced toward the door again, not expecting Gabrielle to return, not yet, but understanding now that her absence did not mean the situation had ended. It meant it had expanded. Back in the office building, Gabrielle stepped into a conference room where 2 additional members of her legal team were already waiting, laptops open, screens filled with incoming data. And as she took her seat at the head of the table, there was no formal introduction, no need for explanation, because everyone in the room already understood the gravity of what had been set in motion. We are not reacting, Gabrielle said, her voice calm, controlled. We are documenting. And the distinction mattered, because reaction was temporary, but documentation was permanent. And as her team moved into position, organizing evidence, aligning timelines, preparing for what would come next, the bank across town continued to operate under a reality it no longer fully controlled, its systems restricted, its authority diminished, its narrative unraveling one confirmed detail at a time. And somewhere between those 2 spaces, the outcome had already begun to take shape, not through noise, not through confrontation, but through something far more decisive, the quiet, precise movement of accountability. Hours later, the bank no longer felt like the same place. Even though nothing about its structure had changed, the marble floors were still polished, the lighting still precise, the desks still arranged in perfect alignment. But the atmosphere had shifted into something unmistakably different, something tighter, heavier, like a room waiting for a verdict it could not predict. The manager stood behind the front desk, no longer pacing, no longer issuing instructions, just standing, his hands resting on the surface in front of him as if holding on to something that was already slipping away. And across the lobby, conversations had thinned into low murmurs, customers lingering not out of necessity but curiosity, because whatever had begun earlier had not resolved, it had evolved. The first sign did not arrive with noise, it arrived with presence, the front doors opening again, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet precision. And this time the people who walked in did not hesitate, did not look around for direction. They moved with purpose, 3 individuals in tailored suits, followed by 2 more carrying cases, their posture composed, their expressions neutral, but their presence unmistakable. The room noticed immediately, not because they announced themselves, but because they did not need to. Authority, real authority, did not raise its voice. It entered and let the space adjust to it. Ethan Cole was the first to recognize what was happening, his attention sharpening as the group approached the front desk, his earlier realization now fully anchored in the present. Because this was not coincidence. This was continuation. The lead attorney, Caroline Pierce, stepped forward without hesitation, placing a slim folder on the desk with controlled precision, her voice calm, clear, and impossible to ignore. We are here on behalf of Gabrielle Hudson, she said. And the name, spoken again, carried a different weight this time, no longer uncertain, no longer questioned, but confirmed, reinforced by the presence that stood behind it. The manager straightened instinctively, his earlier posture returning for a moment, as if he could meet this new situation with the same authority he had used before. But the difference was immediate, because this was not something he could dismiss, not something he could redirect. "What is this about?" he asked, though the question sounded less like inquiry and more like delay. And Caroline did not look at him with confrontation. She looked at him with finality. "An internal compliance review has been formally initiated," she said, her tone steady. "And this branch is now under active investigation for procedural violations, including failure to verify executive identity and unauthorized client removal." And each word landed with precision, not raised, not emphasized, but undeniable. Behind her, one of the team members opened a case and removed a tablet, connecting it seamlessly to the branch system. And within seconds the screens behind the desk flickered again, this time not with restriction, but with access being reassigned, controlled externally, beyond the reach of anyone in the room. The assistant stepped back slightly, her earlier familiarity with the system replaced by something closer to distance, because the system was no longer responding to her. It was responding to them. "You cannot just come in here and take over operations," the manager said, attempting to reclaim ground. But even as he spoke, the words lacked foundation, because the very system he depended on was no longer aligned with him. Caroline did not react. She simply opened the folder and turned it toward him. The documentation already complete, timestamps, recorded statements, internal flags, all laid out in a sequence that told the story without needing interpretation. "We are not taking over," she said. "We are enforcing." And the distinction settled into the room like a final line being drawn. Customers who had remained now watched openly, no longer uncertain about what they were witnessing, because the shift was no longer subtle. It was visible, structured, unfolding in real time. Ethan felt the moment land fully now, the abstract becoming concrete, the earlier tension resolving into something definitive, because the question was no longer what had happened, it was what would happen next. The manager looked down at the documents, then at the screens, then back at Caroline. And for the first time since the beginning of the day, he did not have an immediate response, because there was none that could change what had already been set in motion. Outside, the light had shifted slightly, the afternoon settling in, traffic continuing as it always did, but inside the bank, time seemed to narrow, focusing everything into this single point. This single moment where authority had changed hands without a single raised voice. And then, just as the room adjusted to that realization, the doors opened once more, not rushed, not forced, but timed, and Gabrielle Hudson stepped back into the bank, her presence quiet, composed, exactly as it had been before, except now there was no question about who she was, no uncertainty about where she stood, because the room had already been prepared for her return. And as she walked forward, every eye followed, not out of curiosity anymore, but recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent what comes next, but exactly in time to understand it. Gabrielle Hudson did not rush as she walked across the lobby, her steps measured, controlled, the same quiet rhythm that had carried her out earlier now carrying her back in. But everything around her had changed, the space no longer resisting her presence, no longer questioning it, instead adjusting to it, aligning itself in real time with the truth that had already taken hold. The conversations that had filled the room before had fallen away completely now, replaced by a silence that was no longer uncertain but aware, every person in the lobby understanding, at least in part, that they were witnessing the consequence of something they had just seen begin. Caroline Pierce stepped slightly to the side as Gabrielle approached the front desk, not out of deference but precision, making space for the center of gravity in the room to settle exactly where it belonged. And Gabrielle stopped just a few feet from the manager, close enough that there was no distance left to hide behind, but far enough that her composure remained untouched. The manager opened his mouth as if to speak, to explain, to recover something from the collapse that had already begun, but no words came out, because whatever explanation he might have offered no longer matched the reality in front of him. Gabrielle looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be understood, and when she spoke, it was quiet, controlled, but it carried through the entire room without effort. "You asked me to leave a place I built," she said, each word deliberate, grounded in fact, not emotion, and the sentence settled into the air like something permanent, something that could not be undone. Behind her, one of the legal team members tapped the tablet, and instantly the large display behind the desk activated, the surveillance footage from earlier that morning appearing without delay, the angle clear, the audio precise, the interaction replaying in full view of everyone present, not edited, not interpreted, just shown exactly as it had happened. The manager's posture shifted again, not defensively this time, but inwardly, as if the weight of the evidence had moved from abstract to undeniable, because it was no longer a matter of memory or perspective. It was recorded, preserved, and now shared. Customers who had remained in the lobby leaned slightly forward, not out of curiosity anymore, but recognition, because the narrative they had witnessed earlier had just been confirmed in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. The assistant behind the desk lowered her gaze, her earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, more reflective, while the security guard stood completely still, his role now clearly defined. In a context he had not anticipated when he took a single step forward hours before. At 10:17 a.m., identity verification was requested but not executed, Caroline said, her voice steady as she referenced the timeline. At 10:19 a.m., removal was initiated without confirmation of account status or executive clearance, and each timestamp landed like a marker, building a structure around what had previously been dismissed as routine. Gabrielle did not look at the screen. She did not need to, because she had already lived the moment once, and now she was watching something else unfold, something larger, the system responding to itself. "You did not check who I was," she continued, her gaze still on the manager. "You decided who I was." And that distinction, simple as it sounded, cut deeper than anything else that had been said, because it exposed not just an action, but a pattern. The manager swallowed slightly, his earlier authority fully gone now, replaced with something closer to realization, because the room had shifted beyond his control, beyond his influence, and he was no longer the one defining what was happening. The legal team member at the tablet moved again, and the system responded instantly. Access logs appearing, employee records flagged, internal compliance alerts expanding across the interface in real time, each one tied to the same incident, the same sequence of decisions that had led to this exact moment. Effective immediately, branch operations are under executive review, Caroline stated, her tone unchanged. All decision-making authority is suspended pending investigation. And as she spoke, the screens behind the desk reflected the change, permissions removed, controls reassigned, the structure of power within the branch visibly shifting in front of everyone present. Ethan Cole stood quietly near the edge of the lobby, watching as the process reached its peak, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just aware, because the truth he had recognized earlier had now fully materialized into consequence, and there was nothing abstract about it anymore. Gabrielle took a small step forward, not to close distance, but to mark the moment, her presence now fully acknowledged, fully understood, and when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but it carried something final within it, something that did not invite response. "This was never about a mistake," she said, her eyes steady. "This was about a pattern you thought no one would challenge," and the room held that sentence in silence, because there was nothing left to add, nothing left to reinterpret, only the reality that had been revealed, documented, and now enforced, exactly as it was meant to be. The room did not erupt, it did not fracture into chaos, it settled, and that was what made it final, because when truth lands with enough weight, it does not need noise to prove itself, it simply replaces everything that stood before it. Gabrielle Hudson stood at the center of that stillness, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if the outcome unfolding around her was not something she had forced into existence, but something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. The manager lowered his gaze, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet recognition that there was no version of this moment where he remained in control, and for the first time since the day had begun, he did not try to speak, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to reframe. Behind him, the system continued its work, flags locking into place, access restrictions solidifying. Internal notifications cascading across departments far beyond the walls of this branch, each one carrying the same conclusion forward, each one ensuring that what had happened here would not remain contained to this room. Caroline Pierce stepped forward slightly, her voice steady as she delivered the next phase without hesitation. Effective immediately, all involved personnel are placed under administrative suspension pending full review. And the words were not loud, but they carried a permanence that could not be mistaken, because this was no longer a warning, no longer a possibility, it was action. The assistant closed her eyes briefly, not in resistance, but in acceptance, while the security guard stepped back fully now, his earlier position erased by the clarity of what had unfolded. And the manager remained still, absorbing the shift not as a single moment, but as the accumulation of every decision that had led him here. The customers who had remained in the lobby did not applaud. They did not react with spectacle. They simply watched, because what they were witnessing was not entertainment, it was consequence, and it carried a different kind of weight. Ethan Cole exhaled slowly, the tension that had built inside him throughout the morning releasing not as relief, but as understanding, because he had seen the moment before it was named, and now he was watching it complete itself exactly as it had been set in motion. Gabrielle finally shifted her gaze away from the manager and looked around the room, not searching, not judging, but acknowledging, because this was never about one person. It was about a system that had revealed itself through one moment, one decision, one assumption made without question. She took a single step forward, her voice calm, clear, carrying through the space with the same controlled precision it had held from the beginning. "I did not raise my voice," she said, not as a defense, but as a statement of fact. "I did not argue. I did not demand. I gave you the chance to do what your role required." And she paused just long enough for the words to settle, for the meaning to take hold. "And you chose something else." The sentence lingered in the air, not confrontational, but definitive, because it did not accuse, it concluded. Outside, the late afternoon light had shifted again, casting longer reflections across the glass doors, the city continuing its rhythm as if nothing had changed. But inside, everything had, because the space that once questioned her presence now stood reorganized around it. Caroline closed the folder on the desk with quiet finality, the sound soft but unmistakable, like the closing of something that would not be reopened the same way again. Gabrielle turned slightly, her attention no longer fixed on what had been corrected, but on what would come next, because for her, this was not the end of a moment. It was the reinforcement of a standard, one that did not rely on recognition, appearance, or assumption, but on structure, accountability, and truth. And as she began to walk toward the exit once more, this time not alone, but followed by the quiet presence of a system that had aligned itself with her, the room remained still, not because it was uncertain anymore, but because it understood, finally, that what had just happened was not a reversal. It was a revelation, one that would not fade with time, one that would remain long after the doors closed behind her, embedded in every process, every decision, every moment where someone might again be tempted to decide who belonged without ever asking the only question that mattered.